Despite being one of the most beloved and richest aspects of the DC universe, Green Lantern today is still a somewhat divisive character. To love the Lantern is to dive into one of the most gratifying and yet simultaneously frustrating comics in DC's library. For all the potential that corner of the mythos has, it never seems to be far away from the next big controversy. It was a Green Lantern storyline that denoted the women in refrigerators trope in the mid-90s, while the series itself always seems to be at the center of DC's most divisive retcons, whether introduced in a Lantern comic itself or in a crisis further down the line. Ultimately, it's this big, old, lovable, and endlessly frustrating aspect of DC continuity. I'm Yoon from What Culture, please don't hate me, and here are 10 problems no one wants to admit about Green Lantern. Number 10. Hal Jordan is the least interesting Lantern. Hal Jordan is, in many ways, the quintessential superhero. He kickstarted the most interesting aspects of the Green Lantern mythos all the way back in his first appearance in 1959's Showcase number 22, and fits the definition of an establishment superhero. He's a former pilot, a middle-aged white man, and the very picture of authority, policing on a planetary scale. Factor in the likes of DC The New Frontier, a departure from Hal's typical characterization anyway, and much of Jeff Johns' run too, and it stands to reason that Jordan is DC's most storied Lantern. But he's not the publisher's only one. A few decades, a death and a surprise resurrection later, and Jordan is once again DC's main GL. This has often come at the expense of his comrades, with Hal once again an unremarkable establishment character. Grant Morrison and Liam Sharp are doing great things in The Green Lantern, but Hal has, for so many years now, cut a very uninspiring figure on and off the page. Just when exactly will his colleagues get the same opportunities he's had? Number 9. GL Rebirth made things worse. A storyline called Emerald Twilight was meant to spell Hal Jordan's doom in the mid-90s, and for a while, it did just that. The storyline saw the Silver Age Lantern go insane after Mongol destroyed his hometown of Coast City. He took on the Lantern Corps itself, tapped into the power battery on Oa, and renamed himself Parallax. He killed the entire Corps, which made Kyle Rayner the last Lantern and himself a recurring villain, up until 0 Hour Crisis in Time came along. That story saw Jordan sacrifice himself to save the galaxy, where he would then become the new version of the Spectre. Other Lanterns filled the void, but writer Jeff Johns decided to resurrect him in 2005 with GL Rebirth, which retconned the whole Parallax business to have been an alien entity that controlled Hal to commit the aforementioned genocide. Hal's return was itself a little obtuse, but erasing the red in his ledger made it so much worse. He was no longer accountable for his own actions, and him lashing out at Batman was the petulant cherry on top of an already contrived cake. Number 8. Jon Stewart has been criminally underused since Justice League. If you were raised on the DC animated universe, then you probably have a thing for Jon Stewart. Jon was the Lantern in both Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, and was brought to life by Phil Lamar. The show's creators actually faced pushback from fans for Jon being included, but several seasons and dozens of wonderful episodes later, and they'd more than justified Stewart's inclusion. Introduced in 1971, Jon Stewart has always had to settle for second best when it comes to his comics. He's been a staple of the DC universe for decades, but he's never really been afforded the opportunity to lead a comic like either Hal or Kyle has, at least not for as long a period. And when the perfect opportunity for him to be the main GL came around after Justice League, DC didn't take it. Number 7. The hate for Guy Gardner makes no sense. Always the bridesmaid and never the bride, Guy Gardner is constantly seen as DC's most derided Lantern, a hate figure for both GL fans and wider DC readers to rail against whenever he appears, hence the admittedly hilarious one-punch moments in Justice League International. But that's kind of the point. When Steve Englehart and Joe Staton turned Gardner into the GL Corps' very own Jingo representative, they did so to provide a foil to Jon Stewart. Gardner was brash, abrasive, and generally unlikable, but his cartoonishly toxic personality also makes him extremely enjoyable to read, and thus as the years went by, Guy became more and more likable and heroic. He attained nuance. Unfortunately, like Jon, Gardner has found himself taking a back seat since Hal's resurgence. He's still around and has had the spotlight at numerous points, but he's never been anything more than a backup, and one derided by plenty of readers at that. Number 6. Kyle Rayner should have been the main Lantern for longer. If you stumbled across an obnoxious only 90s kids will remember this quiz, and that quiz just so happened to feature a GL segment, there's a strong chance Kyle Rayner would be on there. Introduced in the very same story arc that was meant to spell Hal Jordan's end, Kyle Rayner was a hero unlike most seen in the DCU. For starters, he was an artist, not a soldier, businessman, or reporter, and for a hero that draws their power from imagination and creativity, that is genius. He was also half Latino, and his experiences living and working in the West Coast would go on to form the kind of Lantern eventually go on to be known as in the years to come. Rayner is an interesting case because he's constantly seen as the most powerful lantern in the biz. He was literally Ion, and wielded the power of the White Lanterns thereafter. And yet, despite his perceived power, he's not been at the forefront of the lanterns for what seems like ages. Number 5, his comics are way too action heavy. Green Lantern has one of the coolest powers in comics history. He can create anything that comes to mind and use it as a weapon, mode of transport, or whatever else springs to mind. The possibilities are literally boundless, and it enables artists to go wild with what's on page. With that in mind, it's only natural that a lot of GL's books have focused on action. Factor in how the series is basically DC's own version of Star Wars, and it would be fair to say that a GL comic without a big set piece would seem lackluster compared to the one on stands that did. In truth, the problem isn't even that there's action. It's more that it seems to take primacy over other more interesting questions that could be asked of the core, and namely the kind of ones O'Neill asked in GLGA back in the 70s. Are the core a police force or a paramilitary organization? What are the ethical quandaries of having galaxy-wide jurisdiction? And is there something to be asked about the role of an intergalactic space cop when police forces continue to be scrutinized for brutality, rights violations, and institutionalized discrimination? These questions have absolutely been broached in the past, but they've taken a backseat in more recent years. A more introspective story is called for, and it's one Grant Morrison and Liam Sharp have delivered in The Green Lantern, but so far it's the exception and not the rule. Number 4, their weakness shouldn't be a big deal. Anyone who derides or even supports Green Lantern is aware of two things. Alan Scott's weakness to wood was ridiculous, and so was Hal Jordan's susceptibility to the color yellow. Both were apparently relics of the Golden and Silver Ages, and neither had a place in a maturing industry filled with a fishman space cop, a cabal of blue-headed intellectuals, and a sentient planet that was also a space officer in some weird way. See what I mean? No one's saying that having your character be vulnerable to wood and yellow isn't pretty goofy, but so are plenty of things about comics. They're comics, and GL in many ways represents the pinnacle of Silver Age goof when it comes to the DC universe, and that's a good thing. In a bid to modernize the character, both Scott and Jordan's weaknesses have been retconned into something slightly more believable, but did they even need that sort of treatment in the first place? I don't think so. Number 3, nostalgia for the Silver Age has hurt the character. While a general dislike for the less believable aspects of the Silver Age has pervaded DC in the modern era, the company at the same time seems to be obsessed with that period. It's yielded some wonderful results, but sometimes the focus can get a tad overbearing. It's a consequence of most writers and artists at the company having grown up on the original Flash and GL comics of the 50s and 60s. But it's a double-edged sword. For every wonderful zany commentary about DC's most bonkers period, there are about several more that limit their reappraisal to the surface level, looking to reinstate childhood icons in what, from the outside at least, looks like a nostalgia-driven obsession. The Silver Age resurgence arrived towards the middle of the 2000s and is what saw the likes of Hal Jordan and Barry Allen, the second Flash, return to mainstream continuity. Hal came back to the DCU not out of any given need, but because he was the first. A pioneer he may be, but far more interesting lanterns had emerged in the years since Jordan absented the spotlight. It's time they moved on, lest the other lanterns be relegated to a supporting role for years to come. Number 2, Alan Scott is criminally overlooked. Alan Scott might not be a lantern along the same lines as Hal, Guy, or John, but he's no less important. The character arrived during the 40s as a part of DC's first generation of heroes, utilizing magic while donning an extraordinary cape to battle mobsters and spies during his earliest adventures. And while there's no denying the comic Space Age reboot is superior, that's no reason to overlook the publisher's first lantern. For starters, Scott's focus on magic over science is a big strength. Scott is a cornerstone of that mythos alongside the likes of Zatanna and Dr. Fate, and his position on the Justice Society of America makes him a storied character in DC's library. Add in the New 52 reveal that the character was gay too, and it's clear DC have an amazing platform with the hero that they're yet to fully take advantage of. And number 1, the focus on humans is kinda boring. Of all the problems present with DC's Lantern, this one seems to be the biggest pitfall. To date, the publisher has spotlighted 6 human lanterns at any one point in time. They head to space and interact with all sorts of colourful aliens, but in the end, their roots are all planted firmly on Earth. That in itself is fine, but what about the beloved supporting cast of aliens present? The likes of Kilowog, Tomar Ray, Liara, and Katmoa Tui have all developed followings over the years, and there's all sorts of weird and wonderful aliens to have served on the core. In the grand scheme of things, human lanterns are only a recent phenomenon. And while it's understandable as to why storytellers elect for human voices in their GL books, what about all the weird and wonderful extraterrestrials? Is it not time that they got their own chance to shine in the spotlight? I think so.